My name is Rachel Palmer. I'm 37, and just last week I attended a professional gala where I was being honored for my work in research and education. Reworded, I'm Rachel Palmer, 37 years old, and just last week I was recognized for my contributions to research and education at a formal gala. It was a night I'd been anticipating for weeks, a celebration of everything I'd built over the years. Reworded. This was an evening I'd looked forward to for ages, a momentous occasion marking the culmination of my life's efforts. But as fate would have it, the moment I stepped into the restroom to take a breather, I came face to face with someone I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. My mother. Reworded. However, as luck would have it, as soon as I entered the ladies' room for a moment of peace, I unexpectedly encountered a person I hadn't laid eyes on in almost 15 years, my own mother. She was at the sink reapplying her lipstick, looking every bit the part of the wealthy socialite she'd always been. Reworded. There she was, touching up her lipstick at the basin, embodying the quintessential affluent socialite she'd always been. For a moment, I thought maybe she wouldn't recognize me, but then her eyes flicked up to the mirror and landed on my reflection. Reworded. Initially, I wondered if she'd even know me, but then her gaze shifted to the mirror and settled on my image. Her hand froze mid-motion, and I saw her jaw tighten. Reworded. Her hand stopped abruptly, and I noticed her jaw clench. Rachel, she said, her voice cool and detached, like we just bumped into each other at a country club instead of a bathroom. After 15 years of silence, I didn't expect to see you here. Reworded. Rachel, she uttered, her tone distant and unfeeling, as if our encounter were merely a casual meeting at a country club rather than a reunion after a decade and a half of no contact. I wasn't expecting to run into you here. I steadied myself, gripping the edge of my clutch. Reworded. I composed myself, my fingers tightening around my purse. I could say the same, I replied, keeping my tone even. What brings you here? Reworded. The feeling's mutual, I responded, maintaining a level voice. What are you doing here? She turned to face me, her posture as rigid as ever. Reworded, she pivoted to confront me, her stance still as unyielding as always. Your father and I were invited. Of course, we've always been involved with organizations that support education, and you. Reworded. Naturally, your father and I received an invitation. We've consistently supported educational organizations, she stated. And you. I'm being honored tonight, I said, meeting her gaze for my work and research. Reworded. I'm being celebrated this evening, I informed her, holding her gaze. For my contributions to research. Her expression barely shifted, but I caught the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes before she masked it. Reworded. Her face showed little change, though I detected a fleeting hint of astonishment in her eyes before she quickly concealed it. I see, she said, turning back to the mirror. Well, I suppose everyone finds their way eventually. Reworded. I see, she remarked, facing the mirror once more. Well, I guess everyone eventually finds their path. Her words brought me back to the day I walked out of that house for the last time. Reworded. Her comment transported me back to the moment I departed that house for good. I was 19, and the years leading up to that moment hadn't been easy. Reworded. I was 19, and the preceding years had been quite challenging. In high school, I struggled with depression, but in my family, that wasn't something you admitted. Reworded, during my high school years, I battled depression, but acknowledging such struggles was simply not done in my family. What could you possibly be sad about? My mother had said once, her voice dripping with irritation. When I tried to open up to her, "You have everything more than most kids your age. You're just making excuses." Reworded, what could you possibly be upset about? My mother had snapped at me once, her voice laced with annoyance when I attempted to confide in her. "You possess more than most young people your age. You're just fabricating excuses." The truth was, I'd been drowning. The pressure to be perfect, to live up to, the Palmer name was suffocating. Reworded. In reality, I felt overwhelmed. The burden of achieving perfection and upholding the Palmer reputation was stifling. I tried to keep up, but my grades started slipping during my junior year, and by senior year, I was barely holding on. Reworded. I attempted to maintain my performance, but my grades began to decline in junior year, and by senior year, I was barely managing. My parents didn't see a kid who needed help. They saw a failure, an embarrassment. Reworded, instead of seeing a child in need of support, my parents viewed me as a disappointment, a source of shame. When I only got into a community college, my father's fury was unmatched. Reworded, my father's rage was unparalleled when I only gained admission to a community college. This family has standards. He had said that night, pacing the living room while I stood there clutching my acceptance letter, "And you've done nothing but drag us down." Reworded, our family upholds certain standards. He had declared that evening, striding across the living room as I stood there, clutching my acceptance letter. "And you've done nothing but bring us disgrace. You want to waste your life? Fine, but you'll do it on your own." Reworded, if you wish to squander your life, so be it, but you'll do so independently. I had been kicked out of the house. Reworded, I was expelled from the family home. I remembered the weight of that duffel bag as I left the house that night. It wasn't just filled with clothes, it held the reality of being completely on my own. Reworded, I recall the heft of that duffel bag the night I departed. It contained not just clothing, but the stark reality of complete. My parents didn't even come to the door to say goodbye. Reworded, my parents didn't even bother to see me off at the door. My mother stayed seated on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if I didn't exist. Reworded, my mother remained on the sofa, engrossed in her phone, acting as though I weren't even there. My father had disappeared into his study after delivering his ultimatum. Reworded, my father had retreated into his study following his final pronouncement. I felt invisible, discarded, like I'd never been a part of their world to begin with. Reworded, I felt unseen, cast aside as if I had never truly belonged in their lives. For the first few weeks, I stayed with a friend, sleeping on her pull-out couch while I tried to figure out my next steps. Reworded, during the initial weeks, I resided with a friend, sleeping on her sofa bed as I contemplated my future. Community? College wasn't glamorous, but it felt like the only thing I could control. Reworded, community college was far from luxurious, but it offered the sole sense of control I had. I worked part-time at a diner to cover tuition and rent. Reworded, to pay for my tuition and rent, I took on a part-time job at a diner. When I finally scraped together enough to move into a tiny studio apartment, it was a grind balancing classes, work and the overwhelming sense of failure that clung to me like a second skin. Reworded. Once I finally saved enough to afford a minuscule studio apartment, the struggle intensified, juggling coursework, employment, and the pervasive feeling of inadequacy that clung to me. But something about being on my own away from their constant judgment gave me a flicker of hope. Reworded, yet the independence I gained free from their incessant criticism sparked a glimmer of optimism within me. For the first time, I could breathe, even if the air felt thin. Reworded, for the first time, I could truly exhale, even if the atmosphere felt tenuous. My first year at community college was a blur of late-night study sessions and endless shifts at the diner. Reworded, my initial year at community. College was a continuous cycle of studying late into the night and working countless hours at the diner. I'd decided to study chemistry partly because I genuinely enjoyed it and partly because I wanted to prove to myself and maybe even to them that I could excel in something challenging. Reworded, I chose to pursue chemistry, driven partly by genuine interest and partly by a desire to demonstrate both to myself and perhaps to them my capability to succeed in a demanding field. It wasn't easy. My high school grades had been mediocre at best, and I felt like I was starting from behind compared to my classmates. Reworded, it was difficult. My high school academic performance had been subpar, and I felt at a disadvantage compared to my peers. But for the first time in years, I wasn't under the crushing weight of their expectations. Reworded, however, for the first time in years, I was free from the oppressive burden of their expectations. I could just focus on learning. Reworded, I could simply concentrate on acquiring knowledge. I still remember my first chemistry exam. Reworded, my first chemistry examination remains vivid in my memory. I'd spent weeks preparing, going over every formula, every reaction until I could practically recite them in my sleep. Reworded, I had dedicated weeks to preparation, reviewing every formula and reaction until I could practically recall them effortlessly. When the professor handed back the graded test, I was terrified to look, but there it was, a 92%. Reworded, when the professor returned the graded exam, I was afraid to check, but there it was, a score of 92%. I nearly cried right there in the middle of the classroom. Reworded, tears almost welled up in my eyes right then and there in the classroom. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I'd earned it. Reworded, while not flawless, it was undeniably my achievement. I had earned it. It felt like the first small step toward rebuilding myself after everything had fallen apart. Reworded, it felt like the initial small stride toward reconstructing myself after my life had completely unraveled. Over the years, I evolved in ways I never expected. Reworded, as time passed, I underwent transformations I never anticipated. College wasn't easy, but I had learned how to work for what I wanted, and the more I gave, the more I saw myself grow. Reworded, higher education proved challenging, but I discovered how to strive for my goals, and the more effort I invested, the more personal growth I observed. By the time I finished my associate's degree, I wasn't just a student anymore. I was someone who had learned how to fight for her place in the world. Reworded, upon completing my associate's degree, I had become more than just a student. I was an individual who had learned to contend for her position in society. I transferred to a 4-year university, and while I still faced obstacles, I had learned how to push through them. Reworded. I then transferred to a 4-year university, and although challenges still arose, I had acquired the resilience to overcome them. The shy, insecure girl who barely got by in high school had become someone who could stand in front of a class, explain complex concepts, and hold her own. Reworded. The timid, uncertain girl who struggled through high school had transformed into someone capable of lecturing, clarifying intricate ideas, and asserting herself. Chemistry, once a challenge, became my passion. Reworded. Chemistry, once a hurdle, evolved into my deep passion. I didn't just want to pass anymore. I wanted to excel, to prove that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. Reworded. I no longer simply aimed to pass. I aspired to achieve excellence, to demonstrate that I was not the failure they believed me to be. I worked part-time still, but I also started interning at local research labs, gaining experience that eventually led me to an opportunity I never imagined, becoming a lead researcher at a nonprofit focused on advancing science education. Reworded. While continuing part-time work, I also began interning at local research facilities, acquiring experience that ultimately paved the way for an unforeseen opportunity, becoming a primary researcher at a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing science education. It wasn't just a job, it was my way of giving back, of creating a space where other kids, the ones who were told they weren't good enough, could find their way to. Reworded. This was more than just employment. It was my means of contributing, of establishing an environment where other young people, those deemed inadequate, could also discover their potential. Graduating with my bachelor's degree was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but when it came time to celebrate, I realized something. My parents hadn't even called, not to congratulate me, not to ask about my plans, nothing. Reworded. Earning. My bachelor's degree should have been a celebratory moment, but when it was time to commemorate, a stark realization hit me. My parents hadn't even phoned not to offer congratulations, nor to inquire about my future plans. Nothing at all. My father, the owner of a massive fertilizer company, had more money than he knew what to do with. Reworded. My father, who owned an enormous fertilizer company, possessed an abundance of wealth. He and my mother lived in a mansion, threw extravagant parties, and rubbed elbows with politicians and Reworded. He and my mother resided in a grand estate, hosted opulent gatherings, and associated with influential political and business figures. But for all their wealth, they'd never taken an interest in me unless it was to criticize. Reworded. Despite their considerable fortune, they had never shown any interest in me except to find fault. Even after I graduated with honors, after I'd worked my ass off to get where I was, I didn't exist in their world. Reworded. Even after graduating with honors, and after immense effort to reach my current standing, I remained non-existent in their reality. I was a reminder of their failure, an inconvenient blemish on their perfect lives. Reworded. I served as a reminder of their perceived shortcomings, an unwelcome imperfection in their seemingly flawless existence. It stung more than I wanted to admit. Reworded. It caused more pain than I cared to acknowledge. I had hoped, maybe foolishly, that they'd at least acknowledge the hard work I'd put in, but they didn't. Reworded, I had harbored a hope, perhaps naively, that they would at least recognize my diligent efforts, but they did not. It was as if I never mattered to them, and that realization hit harder than I cared to admit. Reworded, it was as if I had never held any significance for them, and that understanding struck me more profoundly than I would admit. The only family member who bothered to show up at my graduation ceremony was Aunt Lydia. Reworded, the sole family member who took the time to attend my graduation ceremony was Aunt Lydia. She was my mother's younger sister, the black sheep of the family. Reworded, she was my mother's younger sibling, considered the eccentric outlier of the family. Lydia had never cared much for my parents' rigid standards, and while they shunned her for being too eccentric, she was always kind to me. Reworded, Lydia had always disregarded my parents' strict expectations, and while they ostracized her for her unconventional nature, she consistently treated me with kindness. She was the one person who would call on my birthday, even when my parents pretended I didn't exist. Reworded, she was the only individual who would phone me on my birthday, even when my parents acted as though I didn't exist. When I saw her in the crowd, I felt a lump form in my throat. Reworded, spotting her in the audience, I felt a tightness in my throat. She waved at me excitedly from the back, and after the ceremony, I found her in the parking lot waiting with a huge bouquet of flowers. Reworded, she enthusiastically waved to me from the rear, and following the ceremony, I located her in the parking area holding a large bouquet of flowers. "You did it, kid," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you." Reworded, "You accomplished it, kiddo," she exclaimed, embracing me tightly. "I'm incredibly proud of you." It was a small comfort, but it was something. Reworded, it provided minor solace, yet it was something meaningful. It wasn't the cold silence I'd gotten from my parents. Reworded, it wasn't the chilling silence I had grown accustomed to from my parents. Aunt Lydia was the one who reminded me that family didn't have to mean perfection, that love could come from unexpected places. Reworded, Aunt Lydia was the one who underscored the idea that family wasn't synonymous with flawlessness, and that affection could emerge from surprising sources. She didn't care that I hadn't followed the straight path they wanted for me. She cared that I had made it on my own, no matter the hurdles. Reworded, she was unconcerned that I hadn't pursued the conventional route they desired for me. Her concern was that I had succeeded independently, despite all obstacles, a few months after graduation. I was wrapping up a research project at the university when one of my professors, Dr. Collins, pulled me aside. Reworded, several months after earning my degree, as I was concluding a research endeavor at the university, one of my professors, Dr. Collins, called me aside. He was an old-school chemist, the kind who had a passion for the periodic table, like it was a work of art. Reworded, he was a traditional chemist, the type who revered the periodic table as if it were a masterpiece. He'd noticed my work ethic, my persistence, despite everything I'd been through. Reworded, he had observed my diligent work ethic and my unwavering perseverance despite all my past difficulties. "Rachel," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. I've been in touch with some colleagues at Oxford University. They're offering a research opportunity in environmental chemistry, and I think you'd be a perfect fit. Reworded, Rachel, he stated, his voice quiet and contemplative. I've been in contact with some associates at Oxford University. They have an environmental chemistry research position available, and I believe you would be an ideal candidate. At first, I thought it was a joke. Oxford, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, me, reworded. Initially, I thought he was jesting. Oxford, one of the world's most esteemed universities, me. But Dr. Collins insisted. He told me that this wasn't just a job. It was a chance to make real contributions to the field and that I deserved the opportunity. Reworded. However, Dr. Collins persisted, explaining that this was not merely employment, but an occasion to make significant advancements in the field, and that I was truly worthy of the chance. Don't let fear hold you back, Rachel, he said. You've proven yourself. Now it's time to take that next step. Reworded. Don't allow apprehension to hinder you, Rachel, he advised. You've demonstrated your capabilities. Now is the moment to advance. I applied hesitantly at first, not fully believing it could happen. Reworded. I submitted my application with initial reluctance, not fully convinced it would materialize. The application process was rigorous, and I wasn't sure I'd make the cut. Reworded. The application procedure was demanding, and I doubted my ability to succeed. But then weeks later, I received an email. We are pleased to inform you that you've been awarded a research grant for your proposed work in environmental chemistry at Oxford University. Reworded. Then, weeks later, an email arrived. We are delighted to inform you that you have been granted a research award for your proposed environmental chemistry work at Oxford University. I moved to England without telling anyone, not my parents, not any of my old friends. Reworded. I relocated to England without informing anyone, neither my parents nor any of my former acquaintances. The only person who knew was Aunt Lydia. Reworded. Only Aunt Lydia was aware of my departure. I called her a few days before I left, and she was the one who encouraged me to go. Reworded. I telephoned her a few days prior to my departure, and she was the one who urged me to proceed. You've worked too hard to let anything hold you back, she said. Do this for yourself, Rachel. Reworded. You've put in too much effort to let anything impede you, she stated. Do this for yourself, Rachel. She understood why I needed to disappear, why I needed to escape the shadows of my past and carve out a new future without anyone's expectations hanging over me. Reworded. She comprehended my need to vanish, to escape the lingering effects of my past and forge a new life free from the burden of others' expectation. I asked Lydia not to tell anyone else where I'd gone. I didn't want them to try and find me. Didn't want the weight of their judgment pulling me back. Reworded. I requested Lydia to keep my whereabouts confidential. I didn't want them attempting to locate me or their judgment to drag me down. So I left, board in a plane to Oxford with nothing but a backpack and the faint hope that this could be my chance to finally become the person I always dreamed of being. Reworded. Thus, I departed, boarding a flight to Oxford with only a backpack and the fragile hope that this could be my opportunity to finally become the individual I had always aspired to be. I settled into a small flat in Oxford and threw myself into my work. Reworded. I moved into a modest apartment in Oxford and immersed myself entirely in my studies. The first few weeks were tough. The language, the culture, the isolation. But the more I immersed myself in my research, the more I felt at home. Reworded. The initial weeks were challenging: the language, the customs, the solitude, but the deeper I delved into my research, the more at ease I felt. I was working on projects that mattered, things that could make a real impact on the world. Reworded, I was engaged in meaningful projects, endeavors that possessed the potential to significantly influence the world. The chemistry I studied was no longer just about passing exams or proving myself to my parents. It was about changing the future. Reworded, my studies in chemistry were no longer solely about passing tests or validating myself to my parents. They were about shaping what was to come. As the years passed, I completed my master's degree, and then, driven by the momentum of my research, I applied for a PhD. Reworded, with the passage of time, I earned my master's degree, and propelled by the progress of my research, I subsequently applied for a PhD. The process was grueling, but I was determined. Reworded. The undertaking was arduous, yet I was resolute. I had found my place at Oxford, and there was no turning back. Reworded. I had established myself at Oxford, and there was no possibility of retreat. After several years of sleepless nights and endless lab experiments, I earned my PhD, becoming a respected researcher in the field of environmental chemistry. Reworded. Following several years of nocturnal work and incessant laboratory experiments, I obtained my PhD, thereby establishing myself as a reputable researcher in environmental chemistry. After finishing my PhD, the next step seemed almost too surreal to grasp. Reworded. Upon completing my PhD, the subsequent advancement felt almost beyond belief. I was offered a position as a professor at the University of Cambridge. Reworded, I received an offer to become a professor at the University of Cambridge. It felt like a dream I never dared to chase, not because I didn't think I deserved it, but because I never imagined I would be given the chance. Reworded. It felt like a dream I had never permitted myself to pursue, not due to a belief in my unworthiness, but because I had never conceived of being granted such an opportunity. I had worked so hard to get to this point, and yet the recognition still felt like it was happening to someone else. Reworded. Despite having exerted tremendous effort to reach this stage, the recognition still felt as though it were being bestowed upon another person. At Cambridge, I was able to teach and mentor the next generation of students, something I hadn't expected to find so fulfilling. Reworded. At Cambridge, I had the chance to educate and guide future students, an experience I hadn't anticipated finding so rewarding. The freedom to shape minds, to pass on the knowledge and passion I'd gained was beyond anything I could have imagined back when I was struggling through community college. Reworded. The ability to influence young minds, to impart the knowledge and enthusiasm I had acquired, surpassed anything I could have envisioned during my difficult community college years. I had gone from being the girl who didn't belong to someone who could stand at the front of a classroom and be taken seriously. Reworded, I had transformed from an outsider to an individual capable of leading a classroom and commanding respect. But there was still a piece of me that was always looking over my shoulder, wondering if anyone back home knew where I was, if anyone cared enough to find out. Reworded, yet a part of me always remained vigilant, questioning if anyone from my past knew my whereabouts. or if anyone cared enough to inquire. I hadn't heard from my parents since I left. No calls, no letters, no attempts to reach out. Reworded. My parents had not contacted me since my departure. No phone calls. No letters, no attempts to connect. I wondered if they even thought about me. Reworded. I questioned if I ever crossed their minds. As my mother turned back to the mirror, adjusting her lipstick, I felt a familiar weight settle in my chest. Reworded. As my mother pivoted back to the mirror, touching up her lipstick, a well-known heaviness settled. Within my chest, her words, "Everyone finds their way," eventually echoed in my head, and I couldn't help but wonder if she really believed it. Reworded, her phrase, "Everyone eventually finds their path," resonated in my mind, and I couldn't help but ponder if she genuinely subscribed to that idea. I thought about all those years I spent trying to meet their expectations. All the ways they told me I wasn't good enough, the community college rejection, the years of silence, and the way they acted like I didn't exist once I walked out of their house. Reworded, I reflected on the numerous years I dedicated to fulfilling their expectations, the countless instances they told me I was insufficient, the community college rejection, the lengthy period of silence, and their dismissive attitude. After I left their home, it felt like a lifetime ago, but standing there in that bathroom, the bitterness still stung. Reworded, it felt like ages ago, but standing there in the restroom, the lingering resentment was still palpable. I had worked so hard to get to this point, leaving everything behind, moving to England, finishing my master's and PhD, becoming a professor at Cambridge. Reworded, I had exerted immense effort to reach this stage, abandoning everything, relocating to England, completing my master's and PhD, and becoming a professor at Cambridge. And yet there she was, standing in front of me, acting like my entire journey had been some kind of afterthought. Reworded. Despite all this, she stood before me, behaving as though my entire journey was merely an afterthought. I had gone from being the failure they cast aside to someone who could now speak at international conferences, lead research, and mentor young minds. Reworded, I had transitioned from the failure they discarded to an individual capable of presenting at international conferences, spearheading research, and guiding emerging scholars. And for what? To stand here and have her offer me nothing more than a cold acknowledgement. Reworded. And for what purpose? To stand here and receive nothing more than a cold acknowledgement from her. As she left the bathroom, I watched her glide out of the door back to the people she was comfortable with. Reworded. As she exited the restroom, I observed her effortlessly depart, returning to the company she preferred. I thought about the woman I had become, the woman who'd erased every trace of them from my life. Reworded, I considered the person I had evolved into, the woman who had expunged all remnants of them from her existence. I didn't need their approval anymore. Reworded, I no longer required their validation. I'd built a life on my own terms, and even though they would never understand, that was enough. Reworded, I had forged a life according to my own principles, and even if they would never comprehend that, it was sufficient. The gala ceremony began shortly after my mother disappeared into the crowd. Reworded, the formal gala commenced soon after my mother vanished into the throng. I took a deep breath trying to shake off the weight of that encounter. Reworded, I drew a deep breath, attempting to shed the lingering impact of that confrontation. The clinking of glasses, the hum of polite conversation. It all felt distant now. Reworded, the faint clinking of glassware and the soft murmur of polite chatter now seemed far away. It was time to take my place, to step into the role I had fought so hard to claim. Reworded. The moment had arrived for me to assume my position, to embrace the role I had so arduously strived to attain. The stage was set, the light shining down on the sea of well-dressed guests, and the moment I had been anticipating for months was finally here. Reworded, the platform was prepared with lights illuminating the expanse of elegantly dressed attendees, and the long-awaited moment, anticipated for months, was finally at hand. I made my way to the front, where they called my name, the words echoing through the room. Rachel Palmer, honored for her groundbreaking contributions to education and sustainable chemistry. Reworded, I advanced to the forefront as my name reverberated through the space. Rachel Palmer. Recognized for her pioneering advancements in education and sustainable chemistry. The applause was deafening, but it felt strangely hollow, like I was listening to someone else's life unfold. Reworded, the ovation was thunderous, yet it struck me as oddly empty, as if I were observing someone else's life story unfold. I took the stage, trying to maintain a calm exterior, but inside all I could think about was the fact that I was standing in front of an audience of people who knew nothing of the path I had taken to get here. No idea what it had cost me to get this far. Reworded, I ascended the stage, attempting to appear composed, but internally, my mind raced with the awareness that I stood before an audience completely unaware of the journey I had undertaken to reach this point, oblivious to the immense sacrifices I had made. The spotlight hit me, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. Reworded, as the spotlight illuminated me, I felt my heart pound within my chest. This wasn't just a recognition of my work in chemistry. This was my way of showing the world that I was more than the person my parents had tried to make me believe I was. Reworded, this was more than just an acknowledgement of my work in chemistry. It was my declaration to the world that I was not merely the person my parents had attempted to convince me I was. This was the moment where I stood on my own 2 feet, with nothing to prove to anyone but myself. Reworded, this was the instant I stood independently, with no need to prove anything to anyone but myself. As I stood there still trying to absorb the magnitude of the moment, the host's voice rang out, drawing everyone's attention. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have an exciting announcement in recognition of the groundbreaking work in education and sustainable chemistry that will be honored tonight. A generous and anonymous donor has pledged a grant of $2 million to the recipient of this award. Reworded, as I stood still attempting to fully comprehend the significance of the occasion. The host's voice projected, capturing everyone's focus. And now, esteemed guests, we have an exciting revelation to honor the innovative contributions in education and sustainable chemistry celebrated this evening. A benevolent and unnamed benefactor has committed a $2 million grant to the award recipient. The room went quiet, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. Reworded. A hush fell over the room, and I sensed every gaze turn in my direction. My heart raced. Reworded. My pulse quickened. This extraordinary contribution is intended to support the continued efforts of the recipient's research and further their impact on the world of education. Reworded. This remarkable donation aims to bolster the awardees' ongoing research endeavors and amplify their influence in the realm of education. I blinked, momentarily stunned. Reworded. I blinked, momentarily bewildered. $2 million. The number hung in the air. Surreal and overwhelming. Reworded. $2 million. The figure lingered in the atmosphere, feeling both unreal and immense. But the announcement wasn't directly for me. It was for the recipient of the award, someone whose name hadn't been revealed yet. Yet, the declaration wasn't specifically addressed to me, but rather to the award recipient, an individual whose identity remained undisclosed. I was still processing everything when I heard the host's voice continue. This grant, though anonymous, will be bestowed upon the person tonight who has demonstrated exceptional dedication to their work in advancing chemistry and education. Reworded, I was still attempting to make sense of the situation when I heard the host's voice resume. This grant, while given anonymously, will be conferred this evening upon the individual who has displayed extraordinary commitment to advancing chemistry and education. For a moment, I didn't know what to think. Reworded. For a fleeting moment, my mind drew a blank. The enormity of the sum, the way it would change someone's life, was astounding. Reworded. The sheer size of the sum and its potential to transform someone's life was breathtaking. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't shake. The realization that the donor didn't know it would be me. They didn't know I was the one being honored tonight. Reworded. However, another sensation lingered in the air. A realization I couldn't dismiss. The donor was unaware that I would be the recipient, that I was the one being celebrated tonight. As the announcement echoed through the room, my eyes wandered across the crowd, trying to catch a glimpse of the people around me. Reworded as the pronouncement resonated through the room. My gaze drifted across the audience, attempting to observe those nearby. But then something caught my attention, a subtle shift in the crowd near the back, just beside the exit. Reworded. Then something drew my eye. A slight movement in the crowd toward the rear, right by the exit. I saw him, my father. Reworded. There he was, my father. He stood up abruptly, his face twisted in disgust. Reworded. He suddenly rose, his expression contorted with revulsion. His eyes met mine for a brief moment before he turned sharply and began to make his way toward the door. Reworded, his gaze briefly connected with mine before he abruptly pivoted and started moving toward the exit. His movements were swift and deliberate, as if he couldn't get out of that room fast enough. Reworded, he moved quickly and purposefully, as though eager to escape the room as rapidly as possible. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man who had rejected me all those years ago, the one who had kicked me out of his house, was leaving as soon as he heard the news of the grant. Reworded, I was in disbelief at the sight. The man who had disowned me so many years prior, who had expelled me from his home, was now departing the moment he learned of the grant. He didn't even stay to see who was being recognized for the award. Reworded, he didn't even remain to see who would be acknowledged with the award. My chest tightened as a mix of emotions washed over for me, anger, disbelief, and something darker, more bitter. Reworded. My chest constricted as a torrent of emotions overwhelmed me. Anger, astonishment, and something more profound, more resentful. This was the moment I had been waiting for, a moment where everything I had worked for was finally being acknowledged. And he couldn't even bring himself to stay in the room to witness it. Reworded. This was the long-awaited moment, a time when all my efforts were finally being recognized, yet he couldn't even bear to remain in the room to observe it. He couldn't stomach the fact that the daughter he had written off was now standing at the front of the room receiving everything he had always expected from someone else. Reworded, he couldn't tolerate the reality that the daughter he had dismissed was now at the forefront, receiving the very recognition he had always anticipated for someone else. As my father made his way toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Reworded. As my father headed for the exit, I couldn't escape the unsettling sense that something was amiss. The strange weight of his sudden departure settled over me. But before I could process it, the announcer's voice sliced through the room again. Ladies and gentlemen, the host continued, we are incredibly fortunate to not only have a generous donor for tonight's award, but also a longtime supporter of education and sustainable chemistry. Reworded, the peculiar burden of his abrupt exit settled upon me. But before I could fully comprehend it, the announcer's voice once more cut through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the host proceeded. We are incredibly fortunate to have not only a generous benefactor for this evening's award, but also a long-standing advocate for education and sustainable chemistry. The $2 million grant, which will be awarded to the recipient of this honor, has been made possible through the contributions of Mosaic Fertilizers, a company led by one of the most influential figures in the fertilizer industry. Reworded, the $2 million grant to be presented to tonight's honoree has been made possible by the contributions of Mosaic Fertilizers, a company overseen by one of the most prominent personalities in the fertilizer sector. Mosaic Fertilizers, my father's company. Reworded, Mosaic Fertilizers, my father's enterprise. I froze. The donor, the one whose generosity had made this award possible, was my father's company. Reworded, I froze. The benefactor, whose magnanimity had enabled this accolade, was my father's firm. My chest tightened as the truth hit me. The man who had spent years treating me like an embarrassment. The one who had walked out of the room when he learned of my success was the one funding this recognition. Reworded, my chest tightened. As the revelation struck me, the individual who had spent years treating me as a disgrace, who had exited the room upon learning of my achievement, was the very one underwriting this honor. The irony stung deeply. Reworded, the paradox was profoundly painful. The same man who rejected my path, who disowned me for pursuing a life that didn't fit into his perfect image, had unknowingly backed the very award that would be the crowning achievement of my career. Reworded, the very man who had dismissed my chosen path, who had disowned me for pursuing a life that deviated from his ideal, had, without realizing it, financially supported the award that would mark the pinnacle of my professional journey. It was almost too much to process, too much to bear. Reworded, it was nearly impossible to comprehend, almost unbearable. In that moment, I stood there, stunned, as the announcer's words continued to echo in my ears. Reworded, At that instant, I stood bewildered as the announcer's words continued to reverberate in my mind. The applause around me felt distant, like I was hearing it from underwater, reworded. The surrounding applause seemed muffled, as if I were submerged underwater. The weight of the grant, of everything that had just been revealed, hung heavily on me. Reworded, the significance of the grant, and all that had just been disclosed weighed heavily upon me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief moment I couldn't process any of it. Reworded. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a fleeting instant I couldn't comprehend any of it. "Thank you," I managed to say into the microphone, my voice shaky but steady enough. Reworded. "Thank you," I uttered into the microphone, my voice trembling but sufficiently stable. The words felt hollow, too small for what I was feeling. Reworded. The words felt empty, inadequate to express my emotions. But I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out of that room. Reworded. But there was no time to dwell. I needed to leave that room. I couldn't stand there another second basking in the recognition that felt so empty. Reworded. I couldn't endure another moment reveling in such a hollow recognition. I turned abruptly, walked off the stage, and without another glance at the audience, I bolted for the back door. Reworded. I spun around abruptly, descended from the stage, and without a second look at the audience, I dashed for the back exit. My steps quickened as I made my way through the hallway. Heart racing, only one thought running through my mind. My father. Reworded. My pace accelerated as I hurried down the corridor, my heart pounding, a single thought dominating my mind. My father. I knew he'd left the room. I saw him walk out, his face a mixture of disgust and something else I couldn't quite reworded. I knew he had departed. I witnessed him exit, his expression a blend of disdain and something else I couldn't quite decipher. But he couldn't just leave. Not like this. Not when everything had come full circle. Reworded? But he couldn't simply depart. Not in this manner. Not when everything had culminated. I couldn't let it end like this, with him walking out on the one moment that proved everything he had tried to dismiss about me. Reworded. I couldn't allow it to conclude this way, with him abandoning the very moment that validated everything he had attempted to disregard about me. I pushed through the door leading outside, scanning the area, my breath coming in quick bursts. Reworded. I shoved open the door to the outside, my eyes quickly surveying the area, my breath coming in rapid gasps. There he was, standing by his car, his back to me. Reworded. He stood there, next to his vehicle, his back facing me. My feet moved on their own, and before I could stop myself, I was running. Reworded. My feet moved involuntarily, and before I could halt myself, I was running. "Dad," I called out, my voice almost cracking as I rushed after him. Reworded. "Dad," I shouted, my voice nearly breaking as I hurried toward him. He didn't look back at first, his shoulders stiff, but when he finally turned around, I saw the bitter expression on his face. Reworded. He didn't initially turn around, his shoulders rigid, but when he finally faced me, I saw a resentful look on his face. He had that same look I remembered from all those years ago, like everything was an insult to him. Reworded. He wore the same expression I recalled from years past, as though everything was an affront to him. "What is it now, Rachel?" he asked sharply, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Reworded, "What now? Rachel?" he questioned abruptly, his voice colder than I had ever known it. "You think I'm going to congratulate you?" Reworded, "Do you anticipate my congratulations?" I stopped just a few feet away, my heart hammering in my chest. Reworded, I halted mere feet away, my heart pounding against my ribs. I knew what this was about. He had no idea who the recipient of the grant was until they called my name. Reworded, I understood the situation. He had been unaware of the grant recipient's identity until my name was announced. Until that moment, he thought he was just funding some good cause, sending money to the foundation, believing it was going to some worthy academic or researchy he could proudly point to. Reworded, up until that point, he believed he was merely supporting a charitable endeavor, contributing funds to the foundation, assuming the money would go to a commendable academic or researcher he could proudly acknowledge. He didn't know it would be me standing there on that stage. Reworded, he had no idea it would be me standing on that stage. He sneered, his lips curling into a bitter smile. I don't know whether to be disgusted or impressed, but here you are taking my money. I'm sure that's exactly what you wanted, right? Reworded, he sneered, his mouth twisting into a resentful grin. I'm torn between disgust and admiration, but here you are, accepting my funds. I presume that's precisely what you desired, correct? I could see the resentment in his eyes. The grant, $2 million, had come from Mosaic Fertilizers, his company. Reworded, I could discern the bitterness in his gaze. The grant, amounting to $2 million, originated from Mosaic Fertilizers, his company. But once the money was donated to the foundation, it was entirely out of his control. They had chosen who would receive it, and they chose me. Reworded. However, once the funds were contributed to the foundation, he had no further authority over them. They selected the recipient, and they chose me. The irony hit me like a wave. Reworded. The paradox struck me forcefully. I didn't ask for this, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rush of emotions. I never asked for your money or your approval. Reworded. I didn't solicit this. I stated, maintaining a composed voice despite my surging emotions. I never sought your financial support or your endorsement. I earned this on my own, just like everything else. Reworded. I achieved this independently, just as I have everything else. His eyes darkened and he shook his head. It doesn't change anything. You're still the failure I kicked out of my house all those years ago. Reworded, his gaze hardened, and he shook his head. It changes nothing. You remain the failure I expelled from my home years ago. No grant or award is going to change that. Reworded, no amount of recognition or financial assistance will alter that fact. I felt a rush of anger, but I pushed it down. Reworded, a surge of anger welled within me, but I suppressed it. It doesn't matter what you think anymore. I've made my own life, and if that money came from you, it doesn't mean anything to me. Reworded, your opinion no longer holds sway. I've forged my own life, and if that money originated from you, it is meaningless to me. I turned my back on him without saying another word, my heart pounding in my chest. Reworded, I pivoted away from him without uttering another sound, my heart thumping within my chest. I didn't need to argue with him anymore. he wouldn't understand, and truthfully, I didn't need his approval. Reworded, further argumentation with him was unnecessary. He wouldn't comprehend, and honestly, his approval was irrelevant to me. I had spent so many years trying to prove myself to him. And for what? To be here at this moment with everything I had worked for, only for him to stand there bitter and resentful of my success. Reworded, I had dedicated countless years to validating myself to him. And for what ultimate purpose? To arrive at this juncture with all my accomplishments, only for him to stand there embittered and resentful of my achievement. It wasn't worth my time. Reworded, it wasn't a worthwhile use of my time. The next day, I made a decision. Reworded. The following day, I reached a conclusion. I had spent the night thinking about what the $2 million grant meant. Reworded, I had spent the entire night contemplating the significance of the $2 million grant. At first, it had felt like a victory, a vindication, but by morning, that feeling had faded. Reworded. Initially, it had seemed like a triumph, a justification, but by morning, that sensation had dissipated. It wasn't my victory. It was just another reminder of everything I had escaped. Reworded, it wasn't my personal win. It was simply another reminder of everything I had managed to break free from. The money tied to his company was never going to erase the years of pain and rejection. Reworded, the funds linked to his company would never undo the prolonged period of suffering and dismissal. It wasn't going to heal the part of me that he had broken when he kicked me out of the house all those years ago. Reworded, it wouldn't mend the emotional wounds he inflicted when he expelled me from the house so many years prior. So I donated the entire sum, every last cent of it. Reworded, therefore, I contributed the entire amount, every single penny. I didn't want it, not from him, not with the strings that came attached to it. Reworded, I did not desire it, not from him, and not with the implicit conditions it carried. Instead, I directed it toward funding scholarships for underprivileged students. Students who had been overlooked, underestimated, and written off. Reworded, instead, to establishing scholarships for disadvantaged students, those who had been ignored, undervalued, and dismissed. I wanted to give them the chance to build something for themselves without being crushed under the weight of expectations that didn't belong to them. Reworded, I aimed to provide them an opportunity to construct their own future free from the burden of unassigned expectations. The money that had once been tied to rejection and bitterness was now part of something greater, something that would outlast the sting of my father's judgment. Reworded, the funds, once associated with dismissal and resentment, now contributed to something more significant, something that would endure beyond the lingering pain of my father's disapproval. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I pressed the donation button. Reworded, a calm sense of contentment settled over me as I clicked the donation button. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need his money, his approval, or his recognition. Reworded, for the very first time, I understood that I no longer required his money, his validation, or his acknowledgement. I had built my own legacy, one that would live on far beyond the walls of that gala. Reworded, I had established my own enduring legacy, one that would persist far beyond the confines of that gala event.